Assalamu alaikum. I am Noor Muhammad, your English teacher. Today I was supposed to teach you the first poem in your course, Good Timber. But I believe that it is absolutely imperative for you to have knowledge about the basics of poetry before you can really enjoy and appreciate poetry. You need to have knowledge about different aspects of poetry before you can confidently and comfortably read poetry. It is with this purpose I am going to deliver a lecture on elements of poetry. What are elements of poetry? Literally, elements of poetry stand for constituents of poetry. Elements of poetry stand for the things that make poetry. Elements of poetry stand for the building blocks of poetry. What are these building blocks of poetry? What are these constituents of poetry? And what are these things that make up poetry? Let's have a discussion on it. And the first element of poetry that I'm going to discuss with you is figurative language, or you can call that figures of speech. Kids, let me tell you one thing. The use of language in poetry is drastically different from the use of language in daily life. Poets frequently make use of such language which doesn't really make sense on conventional or standard level. Poets frequently deviate from conventional use of language. They say things that are not literally true. And that's why when an ordinary fella who does not really understand poetry and the peculiarities of poetic language, they often interpret poetry as a bunch of lies, and they call poets as liars. But that's not true. The impression that an ordinary man gets from poetry, that a poetry is a bunch of lies, is because they do not understand the special type of language that poets frequently used in poetry. This special type of language, which is not literally true, is often used by poets in their poetry, and it is called figurative language. This special language that is frequently used by the poets in poetry is called figurative language, or different ways of using the figurative language is called figures of speech. So different ways of using this figurative language are called as figures of speech, and I'm going to discuss with you 5 major figures of speech. There are so many figures of speech, but I'm deliberately restricting my discussion to only 5 important basic figures of speech so that you can have a rough idea of what exactly is a figurative language and what exactly is a figure of speech. This is the purpose. Otherwise, I will be discussing with you the other figures of speech as we move on with our discussion of different poems in the days to come. The first and the foremost figure of speech is metaphor. Literally, it is translated in Urdu as istiara. What is a metaphor? Simple definition of metaphor is a figure of speech in which one thing is called as another. One thing that you need to remember is metaphor is a comparison, no doubt about that. But in this comparison, one thing is directly called as another. This is a peculiarity, a difference between metaphor and simile. I will discuss simile later on. A figure of speech in which one thing is called as another. When you call one thing as another, it's called as metaphor, and I have discussed it with you in my previous lectures. For example, calling a tall man as a pole, that's metaphor. Calling a brave man as a lion, Ali is a lion, that's a metaphor. So metaphor is very common, and remember one thing, it is the most frequently used figure of speech, not only in poetry but also in daily life. So here are 2 examples. Time is a thief. So clearly, time is called as a thief. One thing is called as another. So this is called as metaphor. My sun is my star. So I am calling my sun as a star. So clearly, I am calling one thing as another. This is metaphor. There is clearly an element of comparison. Why time is called as a thief? There is a reason for it. It's a comparison. And my sun is my star. I'm comparing my sun with a star. So this is also a comparison. But one thing is absolutely different about metaphor, that it is based upon direct comparison, explicit comparison. One thing is directly called as another. This is the reason we say that metaphor is an explicit comparison. It is a direct comparison. These two are very common examples of metaphor. Let's come towards the next word, the next figure of speech, and it is simile. What is simile? Simile in Urdu, it is called as tashbih. Like metaphor, simile is also a comparison, but unlike metaphor, it is not a direct comparison. One thing is not directly called as another. What is it? Let's go through definition. A figure of speech in which one thing is compared to another with the use of as or like. See, there must be at least one word used in simile, either as or like. That's why it is called as an indirect comparison. Look at it. An example, her face shone like the moon. So she is not called, her face is not directly called as the moon. It's an indirect comparison, implicit comparison rather than explicit. So there is a use of word like here. This is the basic condition of simile in English. There must be a use of as or like. One thing may be compared with another, but one thing may not be directly called as another, like metaphor. So her face shone like the moon. So her face has been compared with the moon, but it is not directly called as the moon like metaphor. Instead, it has been compared with the moon with the use of word like. This is an example of simile. The next, a line taken from Daffodils, the poem written by William Wordsworth. I wandered lonely as a cloud. So you can clearly see that the poet compares himself with a piece of cloud, but there is a use of word as in the middle. He does not directly call himself as a cloud. Rather than that, he uses the term as, the word as in the middle. This is also shows that this is a simile. So there is a comparison and contrast of simile and metaphor that you need to keep in mind. One thing, both of them are comparisons. But unlike metaphor, simile is not a direct comparison. Metaphor is a direct comparison. That's why simile is implicit comparison, while metaphor is an explicit comparison. This is the second figure of speech that you need to keep in mind. Third one is personification. Look at the word from person. Person, you understand the meaning of person, an individual. Person, then personify. Making a person. Personification, the process of making a person. That's the literal translation of the term personification. In Urdu, personification is called as tajseem, sanat tajseem. And tajseem, the word tajseem is from Urdu word jism. And tajseem means the process of giving jism to something. So now you can have a rough idea of what exactly is personification. If you don't, let me give you a simple definition. What is a personification? A figure of speech in which animate qualities are given to inanimate things. Now it's clear. Animate qualities, usually human qualities, are given to inanimate things. In other words, in this figure of speech, a poet gives the qualities of living things, usually humans, to non-living things. For example, human beings can smile, they walk, they talk, they cry, they scream, they shout, they die, they grow, they jump, they sleep. For example, all of these are the attributes of human beings. All of them are associated with human beings. And if you somehow give any of these qualities, any of these attributes to a non-living thing, that will be called as personification. Here is an example. The moon smiled. Just three-worded sentence. The moon smiled. You know that moon is an inanimate thing. It's a non-living thing. The moon does not smile. Yet the poet says the moon smiled. So humans smile, not moon. We are giving a human quality of smile to to a non-living thing, inanimate thing, moon. This is called as personification. In the second example, the sun greeted me in the morning. The sun greeted me. Human beings greet each other. So there is no way a sun can greet somebody. Sun is an inanimate thing, non-living thing. There is no way it can greet anybody. That's why we are giving this quality of greeting to a non-living thing, inanimate thing, the sun. That's why it will be called as personification. So we make use of personification frequently in poetry. This is something that is called as personification. Third is called, fourth one is hyperbole. What is hyperbole? In Urdu language, hyperbole is translated as mubaligha. And you understand what is the meaning of mubaligha, sanat mubaligha. So what is hyperbole? Here it is. A figure of speech in which an exaggerated statement is made. A figure of speech in which an exaggerated statement is made. What does it mean? It means an overstatement is made. So basically, hyperbole is an exaggerated statement, or basically hyperbole is what we call as overstatement. I mean, saying more than what actually is the case. That's called as exaggeration. That's called as hyperbole. Here are two examples. I have told you millions of times. You know it. It's impossible that somebody can tell something to someone millions of times. And we usually make use of it in our daily life. Like metaphor, hyperbole is also frequently used in daily life. And we usually tell people, I have told you millions of times. We know that we have never told anybody, or nobody has ever told anybody millions of times. Yet we use the term millions of times. Millions, literally? No, not possible, remember. So millions is an exaggeration. Millions is actually an overstatement. That's an example of hyperbole. My head was spinning at the height. Now you can see that spinning. Spin is like this. How can somebody's head spin? It's impossible, remember. So it's also exaggeration, remember. Spinning simply means feeling dizzy, feeling giddy. So that has been called as feeling, what we call as spinning. So spinning is an exaggeration, remember. Instead of calling dizzy, instead of calling giddy, there is a use of word spinning, which is clearly an exaggeration. My head was spinning at the height. So kids, this is an example of hyperbole. So this is, you can say. And I remember some lines from William Shakespeare's drama Hamlet, in which the central character, the hero, Hamlet, tries to express his love for his beloved, the dead beloved Ophelia. And he says, I loved Ophelia. 40,000 brothers with all their quantity of love cannot make up my sum. Now he says that he loves Ophelia more than 40,000 brothers of Ophelia can love her. That's exaggeration. You can know it very well. You know it very well that it's impossible for somebody to love somebody for 40,000 times. It's impossible, remember. So this is also an exaggeration. So we also make use of hyperbole in our daily life quite frequently. There's hardly anything unusual about it. So this is the fourth figure of speech. Symbolism. I discussed symbol with you in my previous lectures, but let me explain it once again. What is symbolism? Literally, symbolism means ilamat, ilamtiyat, or ilamti shairi. So what does it mean basically? So here it is, a word, an object, a place, or a character that represents something other than its literal meaning. Again, I mean, when a poet tries to give an extra meaning, some extra meaning to a word, to an object, to a person, to a place, that's called as symbolization. That's called as the process of converting an ordinary word, an ordinary thing, an ordinary place, an ordinary character into a symbol. So you need to keep that in mind too. So, but symbols are not as easy, remember. You need to keep in mind that there is a process of symbolization. If you talk about the common ordinary examples of symbols, well, lion is a symbol of, for example, bravery. And scales are a symbol of justice. Lily is a symbol of purity, for example. We are giving extra meanings to lion, to lily, to scales. But symbolization is a difficult and complicated process. Ordinary students, ordinary people do not really understand it. How symbols are created in poems, that's an important point. I have given 2 examples over here, and I have deliberately picked these 2 examples to give you an idea of how ordinary objects, ordinary things are converted into symbols. So one is this one. When she saw the dove, let me talk about this one. Dove is already used as a symbol of peace, but here, forget about for dove as a symbol of peace. I'm just trying to symbolize an ordinary word, an ordinary thing, dove. So for example, when she saw dove soar above her home, she knew her troubles were over. Now remember, so end of troubles is associated with flying of dove. So now the writer has deliberately associated an extra meaning, end of troubles, end of tensions, end of struggles, with the flight of dove. So this is called giving an extra meaning, an extra sense to an ordinary word that is used in daily life. So this is called as, symbolization. And here dove is used as a symbol of end of troubles and peace and joy and relief. So this is something that you need to keep in mind. So there is another example. The night fell and it hid all the patches in my old dress and my poverty. I repeat, the night fell, and fell doesn't mean falling in that sense, remember. The night came, in other words. The night fell and it hid all the patches in my old dress and my poverty. Now this night, which is a natural phenomena, falling of the night, so it has been given extra meaning, extra sense. In what? Patches of night has hid all the patches in my old dress and my poverty. So here the writer has used night in the sense of a cover-up for poverty, weaknesses, shortcomings. So night has been given an extra meaning of cover-up, of weaknesses, shortcomings, poverty. This is something that is called as symbolization. This is the process of converting night into a symbol. If you use night in an ordinary sense, it will never be called as a symbol. If you use dove in an ordinary sense of a bird, it will never be called as a symbol. But when you try to give extra meaning, associate extra meaning, extra emotions, feelings with the words, that's called as symbolization. So I hope you have got a rough idea of what exactly is a symbol. Kids, remember one thing: metaphor, simile, personification, hyperbole, and symbolism. All of them are examples of figurative language. All of them are examples of figures of speech. What does that mean? It means none of them has been used in literal sense. When time is a thief, it is not literally true. Figurative language is never literally true. Keep that in mind. A figurative language does not make sense on usual level. It does not use words or language in usual sense. That is something that you need to keep in mind. And to sum it up, I can say figurative language is never used on literal level. It doesn't make sense on literal level. So it is not literally true. Time is a thief. Time is not actually a thief. Not factually a thief. Not realistically a thief. So it's just a figure of speech. It's just a use of figurative language. My sun is my star. My sun is not actually a star. It's just non-literal, figurative use. And in the same way, her face shone like the moon. Her face did not really shine like the moon. That's not literally true. In the same way, I wandered like lonely as a cloud. So the poet, did not actually wander exactly like the cloud. It's just figurative use of language. So not literally true. In the same case, personification, the moon smiled, the moon did not literally smile. You know moon cannot smile. So all of them are actually examples of figurative language. In other words, they are not literally true. None of them is literally true. Same is the case with hyperbole. I've told you a million times, you know it. Millions does not literally mean millions here. In the same way, spinning does not literally mean spinning here. So you need to keep that in mind. That's what we call as figurative language, which is not literally true. Same is the case with them, remember. So night never actually hides somebody's poverty. You know that very well, but it has been used in a figurative sense. In the same way, dove is not actually a sign of the end of someone's troubles. Not really true. It's just a use of figurative language. I hope you've got some idea of what exactly is figurative language. Figurative language is a special type of language that is made use of by the poets for unusual meanings, not in conventional sense. Figurative language is used by the poet by breaking away from the conventional use of language. So figurative language is not a conventional language. It's different. It's specialized. How is it different? I've just told you. I hope you've got it. And figures of speech are actually different ways of using this figurative language. This is one way of using figurative language. This is another way of using figurative language. This is another, and this is another. So this was our brief lecture on what are figures of speech and what is the meaning of figurative language. And in the end, I have a critical question for you. And it runs like this. Why do poets make use of figurative language when they can express their feelings, emotions, and thoughts even with the help of the literal language? I repeat, the question is, why do poets make use of figurative language when they can express their feelings, emotions, and thoughts even with the conventional literal language? I mean, when the poets can express themselves with the help of ordinary language that is used in daily life, why do they make use of similes and metaphors and personifications? Why don't they make use of a straight simple language that is employed by ordinary human beings in daily life? What is the reason? Why poets opt for a special language which does not make use on literals, which doesn't make sense on literal level? Why? What's the reason? Think about it, and I hope you will be able to come up with some answers. Thank you very much.